Hi everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the 5 rules of mixing. So, I was looking back. I've been doing YouTube now and online education now for 6 years. I was very lucky about a year or two ago when we won the Tech Award for Audio Education. It's really been a very important and passionate part of my life. I feel like I've been blessed to be able to work on some incredible records with some amazing people. And I've learned so much from working with other producers, engineers, mixers, as well as songwriters and musicians. And this is a blessing to be able to do this and give back. But one of the things I've noticed more than anything else of doing this over the last 6 years is I've grown more from your questions. I've grown more from your interactions. And things that I didn't realize were issues or problems come up because I get asked questions all the time. Things that maybe I've taken for granted over years of doing this. So this 5 rules of mixing is based on my experiences as an online educator as well as a mixer. So the first one for me is all about the point of mixing, and that is creating balance. So number 1, create balance. It is a big part of what mixing is about. If it is the only thing we talked about, it is the most important part of mixing. And of course, balance is 3 very distinct things. It is volume, it is panning, and then it is EQ adjustment. And the reason why I don't say volume, compression, EQ adjustment, and panning is because, of course, compression is there to control dynamic range. Now, that might seem obvious to even a beginner that that's what it's about, but it's more than that. For instance, when you're mixing on, say, this lovely SSL over here, we do this thing called a static mix. And what that is it's getting everything through the SSL, through the console, and then finding an average area that everything works, like a volume that makes everything fit together. And we pan it around and we create some space in our mix. We put guitars away from the center maybe, so the vocal sits beautifully in the center. We put the kick down the center, the bass drum. We put the snare drum down the center, the bass guitar. And then we start, populating around it and creating this beautiful imagery. And that is the quote unquote static mix. That's before you do anything else. And the reality is that's always a great place to start. And it is also, more importantly, a great place to finish. Having everything make sense. Now, if you can get a static mix up on your console, up inside of your DAW, pretty quickly, it will tell you so much about what you need to do. So now the rest of the rules, as it were, that are going to follow are really dependent on this first part of the process. The static mix, the balance of a mix is super, super important. It will tell you everything you need to know. And the reason why I'm overemphasizing this first point, because the next points are probably going to go a lot quicker, but I'm overemphasizing this first point, is because knowing the song and what you want from it and what needs to be got from it, how it needs to end up sounding, is going to guide you in all of your decision making. Now, I've said many, many times in videos, and I will say it again, there is no one size fits all. A song with brushes, an acoustic guitar, and bass, stand-up bass, double bass, contrabass, whatever you want to call it, is going to have a completely different set of criteria for mixing than a massive slamming EDM or huge pop track or metal. They're not going to be mixed and thought about in the same way at all. However, start with the static mix, get those things balanced and panned around, get the volumes balanced, the panning around, get it into something that feels like there's problems there, but generally speaking, it feels like a balanced track. Then these next things we're going to talk about will become very, very apparent. So to reiterate, number one, balance your mix. Get your panning, get your volume set so you can sit back and listen to the song. Now, if you've got a rough mix, great. You can match the rough mix, whatever it might be. But the reality is the reason why you're doing this, the reason why you're balancing the tracks, you're panning them, you're getting volumes to a place where it feels relatively even, is so you can get in the song. You can get in it. You can have a little bit of an understanding. That 20 minutes of just balancing it and panning it is going to be really, really important. So that leads us to number two, using plugins too early. Now, seems like an obvious one. I've heard a couple of people talk about this, and I've probably talked about it in 5 other videos. In fact, I probably at least 5 other videos. It relates to the genre. Now, I'll put up a video and it'll be a video on recording or mixing acoustic instruments. And I'll get somebody tell me they don't think it sounds upfront and powerful enough and loud and crunchy. And then I'll mix something that's got really big slamming tracks and I'll push it to the limit. And maybe I'll even use some limiting and some saturation and distortion. And then somebody else will comment, that's not how the Beatles would have done it back in 1963, because of course it was fully organic and it was going down live. You can see where I'm going. There's no one way to do it. The reason why we talk about records which have fully acoustic instruments and then records that have virtual instruments with synths and they're slamming and maybe they even use, dare I say it, drum samples. You have to, if you want this to be your career, learn how to work with all of these different styles of music. Maybe you'll get lucky and work only in metal. Maybe you'll only work in folk artists with violin, acoustic guitar, and a vocal. Maybe. So you can adopt one method of working. However, the skill is, when do you bring the plugins in? When do you start, after you've balanced your mix, when you start bringing them in? You start thinking about it from the perspective of, okay, I've balanced my mix, I've panned things around, I've got the volumes to where I like where they're at. But even though the vocal sounds like it's loud enough, it's not coming through. Even if I push it up a little bit louder, it still feels like it's fighting. That's where you start going, well, maybe I do need EQ in there. And EQ, of course, at its best, and I'm not going to argue with this, can be subtractive. But the best kind of subtractive EQ is high and low passing, particularly, of course, high passing, meaning removing excessive low end. So you don't want to bring in your EQ too early. But if you do bring in your EQ, use it to clean up the low end and use it to clean up low mids so there's some more clarity down there. So don't bring it in too early to do massive things, because if you bring it in too early to do massive things, like really, really super brightening the vocal, okay, that's great. Suddenly the vocal's sitting on top of the mix. Woohoo, great. But then you're listening to it like after you've done that and you're like, I don't know, that snare doesn't sound bright enough now. So you brighten the snare. And then you're like, wow, my electric guitars, they just don't sound bright enough. You brighten that. And then you're like, oh, all I'm hearing is vocal, snare, and electric guitars. I better put some more top end on that kick. So you put some more top end on the kick. You're like, wow, now it's like really clicky kick and snare and I don't like that. Let's put some more brightness on the bass. And before you know it, you're like chasing your tail, making everything brighter. And I've seen the reverse, The reality is like, try subtractive first. I am not the guy that's going to tell you only subtractive EQ, and that is absolute baloney. I boost all over the place to make things cut through and sound fantastic and be exciting. Absolutely. But in a stage of mixing, try not to use any EQ plugins at first as you're getting into the song. But the EQ you do use, maybe try using some high passing, some low cut, as it were. The reason why I say that is because beginners will get confused, but low cut, high passing. So don't use plugins too early, but make sure when you use them for a purpose, not just for the point of trying to make everything sound brighter and louder. Okay, number 3, and you're going to have a laugh now. Number 3, don't use plugins too late. What? The reason why I say this is now you've got to decide what your objective is. If you're mixing a vocal, acoustic guitar, violin track with brushes like we were talking about earlier, you'll be using minimal amounts of EQ, except for maybe low passing, maybe some compression, but probably more like volume automation, and probably panning to kind of move things around and create some space. However, if you're doing a big, loud, slamming track, working this way is not going to be smart. Because if you, and keep watching till the end because it will all make even more sense, if you choose not to get in there on a big, loud, slamming track early and start shaping things, you're going to fall into a massive trap and you'll be trying to fix things at the end. And this is such a massive common problem. This is like, I could do a video that lasts an hour on this discussion, how there are so many videos talking about putting stuff on your master bus. And as much as I love some of the incredibly clever plugins that have come out, and there's some really great ones, too many people are putting them on the master bus to solve a global problem. Like, oh, it's too boomy. Yeah, why is it boomy? Is it a buildup of low end over multiple channels? So, thirdly, I know it's confusing. Don't be afraid to use plugins in the genre earlier, meaning loud and slamming. So now maybe it's like you get in there and at the earliest possible stage, you shape the kick a little bit more, the bass drum. You shape the snare drum a little bit more. Then you maybe cut some low mids and some low end out of the room mic so it doesn't get too muddy. And now you bus all those drums to a stereo fader. Maybe that stereo fader is duplicated and there is some parallel compression for some energy. Now the bass, maybe you even out the low end. It's a little bit lumpy. And you go through everything judiciously. You don't have to get crazy, but you're going through everything and just bringing it up so it's even. Because this is a rock track. This is not an acoustic guitar and a violin. This is something that needs to hit a little harder. So you need to do these things from the get-go and build something beautiful, build something powerful. This is the differentiator. This is the reason why right at the beginning I was talking about there is no one size fits all. You have to know what you're mixing. You don't want to be that mixer who's really famous for doing emo metal, screamo, whatever it might be, and then get given an acoustic guitar violin track, and then you apply all your compression and EQ techniques to that, and it comes out sounding like a freaking violin hitting you in the face, and the vocals like, ah. You know, that's the thing. And you don't want to be the opposite. You don't want to be the person that's like only believes in 3 mics on the drums and you shouldn't EQ and compress, and then somebody gives you a slamming big rock track and you can't figure out how to get the kick and snare to cut through because you're like, I don't want to use a kick and a snare, and I read that John Bonham didn't it. Well, you know, I know John Bonham didn't do it. But have you ever heard the raw tracks of like In Through the Outdoor? Can you hear how much compression and EQ is on those drums and how like spiky and powerful they are? Yeah, because the music was starting to get more dense. It was getting more modern. And if you want that sound, that's what you do. The point is you have to differentiate when you're going to do that sound. When are you going to do that sound? Is it right for this song? Is it right for that artist? I've said this many, many times, but there is no right way to work. You have to learn all the different things. So, first of all, we said creating a balance. We're going to create the balance. Secondly, not using plugins too early, being judicious about how we use plugins, maybe only using them for high passing. But then thirdly, not waiting too long to use them. If you're working with a slamming big rock track, EDM track, metal track, whatever it might be, you don't want to like paint yourself into a corner because you read on some forum that you should only subtractively EQ. Well, you know what? Try that on a freaking metal track. Go and talk to any of the metal mixers I've talked to and tell them that they cannot boost EQ to make things come forward. Tell them that they can't use compression because you read it on somewhere. It's just not true. But it is true on other genres. It's true on other songs. It's knowing when to do it. That is a secret. So let's move on to number 4. Do not use your mix bus, your master bus, to do your mixing for you. I think you've heard me talk about this in any of the mix videos I've done. I do love the fancy plugins that you can put on stereo tracks and even out the low end and sort out the high mid detail and make sure that the top end isn't too brittle. I love all those fancy plugins. But you do not want to be just using them at the end to solve all of the problems that should be dealt with inside of the mix. If there is a huge low end build-up between the bass drum and the bass guitar and the low end of the synths and the guitars and everything, that needs to be dealt with at that point. You can deal with it with the fancy plugin. You can put the amazing new $300 multi-band compressor. I've tried them all and some of them are absolutely fantastic. But the problem is you'll just get an even low end. Okay, you're probably thinking, what do you mean, Warren? I want even low end. Yeah, but even with no definition. You remember about 4 years ago, I went on a little bit of a mission in my discussions to talk about all of this misinformation about high passing, because every mastering engineer I interviewed said to me, I'm getting these dreadful mixes. I can't find the bass drum, the kick drum. I can't find the bass guitar. It's all just mud down there. And there was this absolutely tons of these misinformation videos saying don't high pass. And the problem is when you're on a small pair of speakers and you can't hear great low end, and somebody says don't high pass, you can't tell anyway. You've got a pair of earbuds in, you're like, I can't hear any 40 hertz, but it's fine, I won't high pass it out. The problem is with all of that super, super low end information, when somebody comes to master it, they're like, what am I going to do? I'm going to try and pull up the thump on the kick, which should be between 40 and 60. They gave you a dB at 40 and 60 and like all this low end from everything that hasn't been high passed is in there. It was pretty ridiculous. It was a discussion amongst every mastering engineer I spoke to. They're like, I don't know what's going on. All these people at home are sending mixes in and the low end's like dreadful. So I did talk about it a lot then, but I'm going to still re-emphasize it to use it as a point. Good, clean, low end. Good, clean, low end is actually louder when you focus on certain instruments. We talked about this a lot, but I'll reiterate. If you've got like big, fat waveforms like this, and one comes from the bass drum, one comes from the bass about here, one comes from a guitar about there, it doesn't matter if they are different sources. If they are all sitting on top of each other, slightly out of time, your speakers don't differentiate. The speaker doesn't go, oh, this is a kick drum. I am going to think differently from the bass. No, it's all the same information. It's all the same information. So if it's all of these instruments, all in the same frequency range, all fighting each other, there isn't like a bigger, better kick, a bigger, better bass. There's just a bigger, muddier mess of low end. It's all slightly out of phase with each other. It's all sort of canceling each other out. It doesn't sound big and defined. It sounds cluttered and ugly and muddy and stodgy and all of the other words that we use to describe a big mess of low end. So don't wait for the master bus to stick on your fancy plugin to make your low end feel good. Because if you're not supplying good, clean low end from that bass kick drum, from that bass guitar or that bass synth, if you're not supplying something that's defined, all that's going to happen is you're going to get a nice, even low end with no definition. So get in there and clean up those areas. High passing is super important. But if you do have an instrument that has issues that need to be addressed, how about taking your masterband multiband compressor and switching that over to the 2-bus of that instrument? Maybe you've got some guitars that are a little like, you've got some super low driven heavy ones, drop A tuning. Plus you've got like 2 or 3 sitting on top, a high line, some big chords in the middle. Maybe you bust those together and stick your multiband on the bus. Or you just stick the multiband on the big sludgy thick drop A guitars. Whatever you do, that is a much smarter way of working than just trying to save your mix on the master bus. I know everybody on the planet, myself excluded, not included, excluded, has done a video on top-down mixing. I don't know any proper professionals that would know what the heck you were talking about. If I said to them, go and load your master bus with all of these fancy plugins and then mix into it, they look at me like, huh? Because if you're pushing into multiband compression, all you're doing is like, nothing's going to get turned up. If you're deciding, oh, I need more bass drum, kick drum, you turn that up, you push more 40 and 60 hertz heavily into it. And what does the master bus compressor do? Bleh. So you're like, what happens? So like the bass guitar that maybe has a little bit of bleed and 60 in there that sounds rich, now just goes down. So you get a even low end, but you don't get a defined low end. It is not smart to mix into that stuff. And plus, probably most importantly, if this is the only thing you remember from this video, if you're mixing into master bus compression like that, multi-band master bus compression, you're not going to learn anything. It's a great catch-all. It's really good for an online educator to tell you to stick tons of stuff on your master bus, because it's pretty hard not to get something that sounds okay, because all of the peaks and transients and low end and everything mid-range is all going to be sort of controlled. So out of the back, you'll get an okay sounding mix. Not a good mix, not a great mix, but an okay sounding. It will translate because you'll go into different rooms and you'll be like, oh, wow, the low end isn't blowing up. I can't hear any definition between the drums and the bass and the keys, but it's not blowing up my speakers anymore. The low end isn't out of control. That is not the way to think. A mastering engineer's job is to enhance what you did, not to just kind of search around to try and find out how to end some low-end definition. And it's not going to be possible if you just got a big blob of low end down there. Don't try and fix your mix with master bus, mix bus, whatever you want to call it, solutions. Number 5, always be thinking globally. Always be listening to the mix as a whole. This is such an important one. If you're sitting there in solo, and I've got nothing against soloing, even though Bob Clearmountain says he never solos, and I trust him. I've seen every other mixer hit solo hundreds of times, and I trust him that he doesn't. He's probably the one that ruined it for all the rest of them because I believe him. He's an amazing mixer. But the reality is you should always be thinking globally. How is everything sounding? If you're sitting there soloing and thinking about one particular instrument all the time, you'll come out of solo, whatever it might be, and suddenly your whole mix is just built around that instrument. And the worst thing is that you might not notice. I had a student the other day, wonderful student. I'm an associate professor at a university, and I teach at a university. I do one-on-one calls. And the student sent me some tracks, and they were really good. But the vocal was like so soft, so safe. It was a good vocal, but it was like there was not a single thing about it that said edgy. It was like the smoothest, most perfect sounding vocal I'd ever heard in my entire life. And guess what? So was every other instrument. I mean, it was supposed to be like a 19, 20-year-old artist, self-produced, young, edgy track, something like Kick Down Some Doors. Instead, it was like easy listening. It made the Carpenters feel like death metal. And, I'm talking to a 19, 20-year-old, and I'm thinking to myself, and I said to them, you got to allow your music to be a little wrong. I know there's all these incredible tools to use, and I recommend them. Soothe 2 is one of the best plugins on the market for getting a great vocal sound. You've seen every other mix engineer and mix producer, engineer, whatever I work with and have talked to has said that they love it. I don't get any affiliate. I am not endorsed, but the reality is, it is true. It's a great plugin. But if you use it excessively on the vocal and pretty much every other instrument, you're going to end up with the softest, nicest sounding, sweetest mix. These tools are there for us to solve problems or to create enhancement, to make things even more exciting and more interesting, not to just be applied on everything so you don't have to think. Always think globally. How's it sounding as a whole? If I'm overly brightening something, then I'm going to have to make everything else brighter. If I'm doing the opposite, if I'm making it sound so sweet and insipid, I'm going to have to make everything else sound sweet and insipid. Think globally. So as you're soloing something and you start tweaking and then you're like 5 minutes in and you're 4 plugins deep and you're still tweaking like crazy, take it out solo. Just, even if you're not sure, just take it out solo. Have a listen and go, is that really improving things? you know what? Maybe take a break, leave the room. Or the other trick that many, many mixers have been talking about for years is play the track, but leave the room. Go into the other room and just hear it coming down the stairs, coming through the hallway, or from the other, whatever it might be. Go and make yourself a cup of coffee with a track playing and get a little bit of perspective. The reality is you always need to be thinking globally. So to me, that's super, super important, because if I do any detail work on anything and I I go there to solve a problem, but then I start enhancing, and then another problem occurs because I enhance, so I have to solve that problem. Before you know it, I've solved a problem, created a new one, solved the problem, created another new one, and before you know it, out comes the most boring sounding thing I've ever heard. Or the opposite, where I get so carried away with this, oh my God, this is so edgy and exciting and crazy, that I go absolutely nuts on it, put it back into the track, and everything else sounds boring. It's like, how do you find that balance? Well, you find that balance by always thinking globally. Wow, that was a lot of fun. There's going to be a cheat sheet for it, so please download the cheat sheet. If you've got any experience with this and you want to share it, I would love to hear it. Again, the most important thing for me is to remember that there is no one genre. There's too much time spent on the right way to mix. Well, the reality is the right way to mix is to be open to new ideas, try new experiments to make things better still, and, like I always say, cut yourself some slack, because everything I'm talking about here, we all do it. All of us do it. All of us make these mistakes. So if you're making them, it's fine. But, like anything, being aware of it and being able to correct it and take a break and hear it for what it is very, very important. And you will continue to make mistakes, and that's okay. That is okay. Each time you do it, your bar is going to get higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. You'll get to that point where that mistake is so small and so irrelevant that you'll sleep on it, get out in the next morning and not even know you did anything wrong, because it's going to sound so good. I feel very blessed to be able to do this, and I've learned this stuff from doing it myself, but like I say, listening to everybody out there. So please feel free to give us your comments and questions, give us your experiences. I would love to know. Thank you ever so much for watching. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. See you all again very soon. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, adio, tschüss, goodbye.